Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Orn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. We have over 30 participants joining today's webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with STARS alumnus Yauheni PREIHERMAN about what the future might hold for Belarus. Yauheni is the founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, an open and geopolitically unbiased platform for research and discussion on international affairs and security in Eastern Europe. Among many other publications, his articles and comments have appeared in Foreign Policy, Carnegie Strategic Europe, Kommersant, Vedomosti, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Guardian, Huffington Post, The Moscow Times, and I'm sure the list will go on. Yauheni holds a BA in International Relations from the Belarusian State University, an MA in European Politics from Sussex University, and he is currently pursuing a PhD in Politics and International Studies at Warwick University. His PhD thesis deals with foreign policy strategies of small states which are stuck amid geostrategic asymmetries. Good morning, Yauheni. I'm happy to see you strong and healthy. Welcome and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Good morning, David, and thanks a lot for putting this event together and for having me.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Yauheni. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Yauheni, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Alexander Lukashenko has been in power for 26 years, and few analysts expected that the 2020 presidential race in Belarus would lead to the boldest and biggest challenge to his reign. To start the discussion, can you tell us a bit about how we got here and what the current situation is in Belarus?
Well, that's quite an interesting thing to discuss and to analyze, I would say. On the one hand, you're absolutely right that only a few and perhaps very few people would expect something like this happen in Belarus if we asked them like a year ago. At the same time, for almost a decade, there were already some indicators in terms of the development of the Belarusian economy that potentially pointed to a possibility of something like this happening. Since we're very short in time, I'm not going into much detail, but Alexander Lukashenko, since his very first campaign, which he really won in 1994, has been this populist type of a politician who wanted to promote himself as the big defender of the social state and basically provided for quite a lot of social security guarantees for the people. And until about 2012, the growth of the Belarusian economy made it all possible, because if you look at the data between 2001, 2010, 2011, the average annual GDP growth amounted to 7.5%, which looks incredible compared to many other post-Soviet states. You can only imagine that most of those states, emerged from the collapsed Soviet Union, and it took them quite a long time to sort of understand where they were going and to try to get stable economic growth. So in those years, Belarus really looked good comparatively. But then beginning from 2012, things started to get much worse. So the average GDP growth between 2012 and 2019 dropped to 1.5%. And of course, all those vast social benefits that people enjoyed were no longer possible, even though the state and Alexander Lukashenko were not willing to cut on those benefits. They had no other option. And that seems to have had two effects. The first one is, of course, the core electorate of Alexander Lukashenko got really upset because they were used to this expanding social state. They did not demand much compared to most of European states, but still, that's something they expected from the government and from Lukashenko. And then at the same time, this worsening situation in the state sector encouraged and stimulated a lot of people to look for opportunities in the private sector and abroad. And then those people very quickly realized that the remaining social state that Alexander Lukashenko was trying to promote was also a problem for them, because it meant, all those taxes, lots of bureaucratic burden, but also the role of the key in the economy, which has been, excessive all the time. You would always have some, issues with Slovakia. Not necessarily that, they would come and try to take your business or anything, but, it all amounted to all sorts of bureaucracy. So in the end, it created this situation where everyone wanted to change, the core electorate, but also those more privately oriented people. And then a series of mistakes were committed by the government. One most egregious mistake, which probably became the trigger of all these events, was the way the government handled the COVID crisis. Right now, I would even argue that it wasn't the policy or lack of policy that was the key problem, but rather the rhetoric which Alexander Lukashenko used to explain his approach to COVID-19. He would say, very strange things like, "Oh, I told these guys not to, go out of their houses, and they didn't listen to me. That's why they died." And it's a little bit of madness, and people thought that it meant that the president no longer cared about their lives. So that has been, and perhaps the very sort of last factor I would mention here is the changing sort of security and foreign policy environment. Between 2014, when the tragedy in Ukraine happened, and these days, Belarus has actually capitalized a lot on its original role as a peace hub and diplomatic hub. And I would even argue that Lukashenko's policies were very smart in that regard. They helped him to mend relations with the West. But at the same time, something bad also started to happen in relation with Russia. And because for a very long time, since 1990s, there was sort of a grand bargain between Belarus and Russia, which meant that Belarus offered its geopolitical loyalty in exchange for all sorts of economic benefits provided by Russia. The bargain could no longer work under the new circumstances. And of course, Alexander Lukashenko faced this need to look for a new model of relations. And unfortunately, the last several years were not particularly successful in that regard. And they also meant that people started losing money because the relations were worsening.
So this was not the first unfair election that Lukashenko has been running. You mentioned the gradual worsening of the economic situation as the key reason why opposition took root this time around, and maybe COVID-19 as a more immediate trigger. After the protests broke out, did Lukashenko miscalculate the situation, or why did the situation escalate so fast?
Well, that's a really good question, and I guess some researchers will need to take serious work on this when circumstances allow and more data exist. But generally speaking, I think the answer is yes. Because of some kind of disconnect between Lukashenko himself and the rest of the public, which in part was the outcome of that sort of changing nature of the relationship between the government and society, and the failure of the social contract that existed before. But I also think that there were some emotional and psychological factors present there as well, because, I had a chance to see some of the people Lukashenko surrounded, and I would argue that some of them were not necessarily very professional there. And it's a different topic why certain people got employed and got some high positions and became the gatekeepers in Lukashenko's surrounding. But as a matter of fact, I think we can be sure in arguing that because of sometimes not particularly high professional level of those people, the information that rich Lukashenko might have been distorted in some respects. And I think that did contribute to the situation where he started to live sort of in a separate world. And of course, when you are, the leader of an authoritarian state for 26 years, by every new day, chances grow that you will get disconnected just because you are treated like a god by your immediate circle. And, I think that was an important reason why, instead of trying to prevent certain problems from happening, even when they were already becoming obvious, Lukashenko would rather, double down on his previous attempts. And instead of talking openly to some opponents, which would have helped at a certain stage of this electoral campaign, he rather, continued to treat them as not even opponents, but some almost enemies. And it did not help, of course, to somehow lessen the tensions in society. And the tensions were growing. Importantly, unlike in previous elections, some very new faces emerged on the political scene. And some of those faces were either from Lukashenko's former entourage, who used to be close to him, and that also sort of sent a signal to people in society that, oh, perhaps something is wrong if people who previously would not even hold a thought about, challenging Lukashenko politically are now do that openly. But also a couple of people with very serious business backgrounds, which again has never been the case before. And those people started to look very credible in the eyes of quite a lot of people in the population. So, all that in the end contributed to qualitatively different campaign we have had here.
On the other hand, it looks like the security apparatus is still firmly behind Lukashenko. So what is their calculation and what could change their calculation?
Well, that's true. And of course, we should first of all say that Lukashenko and the government have been very attentive to that throughout their tenure. And of course, the Siloviki, as we call them, this security apparatus has been one of the priorities of the state. As recently as a couple of days ago, when Lukashenko took this, what some people say, secretive inauguration and oath during the inauguration, he spoke about that. And he once again reiterated that he had been right in treating the security apparatus in that way. At the same time, around mid-August, that is a few days after the election took place, and then perhaps some of our viewers know that Belarus did not have internet for a couple of days. It was almost completely down. But then when the internet was back and everyone saw all those pictures of police brutality, there was a moment when it stirred such an anger in population that a lot of analysts even started jumping into a conclusion that, Lukashenko was done and that his days were numbered. And at that point, we did see a couple of, well, not high-ranking, but still, middle-ranking officials quit their jobs in protest. And I think then a very, important decisive thing happened. Lukashenko gave a call to Putin and asked for assistance, referring to existing bilateral and multilateral agreements between the two states, which also foresee the possibility of security assistance. And I think that was a crucial political signal, primarily for the Siloviki and the security apparatus. The moment they saw that Lukashenko still enjoyed Russian backing, I think the situation more or less stabilized and the government even regained initiative. And, Siloviki were again, the central playing elements of this whole picture.
Let's talk about the opposition. Are the protesters only united in their focus to push Lukashenko out of office, or is there also an agenda beyond just being anti-Lukashenko?
Well, that is interesting. First of all, I should say that this election changed what we really mean by the opposition, because traditionally we had a more or less limited group of people who would claim they were opposition leaders. And, they were opposition leaders as long as Lukashenko was the president of Belarus. So in a way, there was also a social contract where Lukashenko would stay in his position, whereas those in the opposition would enjoy certain benefits as leaders of the opposition, but not really going beyond certain limits in how they challenge the incumbent. But during this electoral campaign, as I mentioned before, we got very new faces, and that also helped to promote this mass uprising. Actually, we don't know for sure how many people voted for Lukashenko, how many people voted for the most popular rival of his, but it was obvious that the numbers of those who did not support Lukashenko were much higher than before. Another important thing is that this electoral campaign turned into a plebiscite type of election, where pretty much the only question on agenda was whether you are in favor of Lukashenko or against him. It is for this reason that in the end, the most popular rival was a woman who just one day before the electoral campaign started didn't have any thoughts about becoming a politician. She was a housewife, and she was a wife of a popular YouTube blogger who himself wanted to run for presidency. But since he was arrested, and she seems to have made this very last-minute decision that she wanted to support her husband by running herself. Of course, some people would say this could not have happened like this, and there must have been some planning for this. I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit in the realm of conspiracy. But what's important is that someone who had no political experience whatsoever became the most popular opposition candidate, and perhaps even, the most popular candidate. Perhaps she even got more votes than Lukashenko. We don't know. But that just tells us that the election was all about a plebiscite. And in this plebiscite type, of course, there was no place for programs. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is this former housewife and who ran against Lukashenko and became the most popular one, her program was very simple. She would say, I don't want to be a president. I want to win this election in order to call for another free and fair election. And in half a year, I'm gone. Of course, technically, you understand, I mean, those who are into this subject understand, it was never possible to win an election and then hold another one in half a year. And that was already sort of a huge risk if someone like her gets into position, and then, what happens next. But anyway, that also just reemphasizes how polarized and how plebiscite type this election became.
What do you see as the biggest strengths and weaknesses of the opposition today?
Well, in the most general sense, the biggest strength is, of course, that it is grassroots and is very decentralized. Until a moment in August, that was the major factor that explains why the government was incapable of suppressing this opposition uprising. Because unlike in the past, when you would have, one or several political leaders, the government would quickly arrest them, and then everything would be more or less over. This time, they couldn't arrest everyone, and that's why the protests continued to brew and to develop. But having said this, the very same feature of this opposition or the protest movement became its weakness around mid-August. Just a few minutes ago, I mentioned the situation when, until Lukashenko gave a call to Putin, there was this feeling by many, euphoric feeling in society that, his days are numbered. It was at that point that the opposition needed to translate this grassroots political sensitivity, political feelings, political energy into a political action that would force Lukashenko to either accept negotiations or just resign. And it failed to do so. So the movement remained decentralized. And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya tried to create something she called the Coordination Council. And she said this would be the political body which would take care of power transfer in Belarus. But of course, the government did everything possible to prevent it from succeeding. And the Coordination Council never even started working properly. Most of its members or the members of the Presidium are either behind bars or abroad. And, they are now doing a lot of diplomatic work, but I don't think this will contribute a lot to the ultimate success of the protest.
So what would it take then for the opposition to move from protests to power?
That's a 1 million question at this point. I would say that after Russia backed Lukashenko, and of course we can discuss it separately because the situation there is not as easy. It has offered its backing, but for the time being, and there are certainly a lot of strings attached to that. But at least what we understand at this point is that once Russian support was there, it became quite obvious that Moscow is now the key kingmaker in this political crisis. Mm-hmm. And I know whenever I mention something like this here in Belarus, a lot of people start criticizing me, saying that, oh, look, you are from those foreign policy elites. You never understood what it means when people, start demanding something, and this popular uprising is, the key factor in all this situation. But unfortunately, I think that since Moscow is now backing Lukashenko and it's ready to go as far as to provide some security officers who could come here and do their business on the ground, there is really very little that the opposition can do right now. And of course, the also understood that they need to reach out to Moscow to establish contacts and to try to argue that the transfer of power would not mean Belarus would become anti-Russian. And they wanted, of course, to make this parallel with Armenia, which, as you might know, a few years ago also experienced a revolution. And someone who became prime minister, the basically key political figure in Belarus, Nikol Pashinyan, had previously been very anti-Russian in his rhetoric. But once he came to power, the first thing he said, look, you need to forget what I said on the campaign trail and before. It's a different life now. I'm the statesman. So people on the Coordination Council in Belarus wanted to make this argument, but I think they clearly failed on that. And the fact that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is sort of the symbol of this whole movement, is now in Lithuania, and Lithuania is perhaps one of the most anti-Russian EU member states, of course, does not help those people to make the case.
Looking ahead, where will all this lead to? What do you see as the most likely scenario to unfold in the coming weeks and months? I mean, ultimately, are Lukashenko's days numbered, or do you think he will manage to hang on to power?
Well, it looks like that for the time being, he will manage. And again, as I said, Russia is very decisive here, and Russia seems to be supporting him for the time being. I think there are two very simple reasons why the Russians decided to do so. The first one is purely geopolitical. They know for sure that Lukashenko, with his ties to the West, cuts, and this is exactly what has happened now, even though in the last 5, 6, 7 years, Lukashenko was the one who did quite a lot to promote rapprochement and normalization with the West. But now his wiggle room is so small that there is almost no room for maneuvering. And for Russia, it means that he's, stuck with them, and that the Russians are again the only geopolitical game in town in Minsk. Whereas anyone else, like Tikhanovskaya, the Coordination Council, even though they, as I mentioned before, they are trying to make the case they are not anti-Russian, but they would mean a lot of uncertainty for Russia. So that's why it was very rational for Moscow to back Lukashenko. And also philosophically, from what I understand, people in the Kremlin do not really accept the idea that post-Soviet leaders should be overthrown under this pressure of mass protest. So does it mean that they are going to support him endlessly? Of course, no. And it's very clear what they want to get out of this whole situation. They want to diversify their political presence and their influence in Belarus, which I think is also very rational on their side. And this means a lot for future possible scenarios, because Lukashenko himself has now started promoting this idea of a constitutional reform. And for him it was and still is very important to sort of refocus the attention of all discussions from the need to hold a new election, because under the current circumstances, he stands no chances of winning another fair election. That's why it's important for him to make sure that he stays for now, and the discussion is focused on the constitutional reform. So it looks like this is going to be the baseline scenario. Lukashenko is strong enough with all those things that I've described to stay for now, but he's not strong enough to suppress the protest. The protest cannot end, again, endlessly in the same way it has taken place so far. So we already have some changes. Instead of daily protests, we have mass protests only on Saturdays and Sundays. And even those numbers are going down. But we also have lots of creativity on the side of protesters. So they arrange some kind of protests in their yards, in some unusual places. And this is going to continue. The problem for the government is that it all sort of demonstrates that its legitimacy is undermined, which means that the government will not be able to think strategically like it was capable only a few years ago. And it also means, again, as I said many times before, that everything will depend on the Russians, because everything will depend on Russian financial assistance and Russian security guarantees. And since the Russians are interested in having their political presence diversified, they want to use the constitutional reform idea to invest into political parties. Part of Lukashenko's success in the past was that he never allowed any political parties to become strong, and most importantly, to become pro-Russian. So he wanted to be the most pro-Russian politician of Belarus, and that ensured that he would always be the stakeholder, the negotiator for the Russians. So yeah, that's the most baseline scenario I can see, and it will of course weaken Lukashenko's presence here over time. He will of course try to do everything possible to sort of limit that process and still remain the key political figure here. But whether he succeeds in this, I don't know. We can only see some very general possibilities here, general scenarios, but what the exact substance of that is going to be will depend on quite a lot of factors. I'm sorry, I cannot give you a very definite response here in this way.
If, like you said, Putin now is the kingmaker. So if Lukashenko's political survival now directly depends on Putin, then do you think Putin will try to aggressively force a solution, or will he just sit back and watch?
I think it's more or less like you said. He has now the privilege and the time, and he's in a very comfortable position, in a much better position than any other external actor. He can sit back, relax a little bit, and watch. Perhaps he will enjoy this process of watching Lukashenko trying to somehow survive, because it's obvious their personal relationship has not been the best one, and there were a lot of personal disagreements and even insults, I think, which Lukashenko, committed in a way. Only a few days before the election, Lukashenko arrested 33 fighters of Wagner Group, this sort of infamous informal organization that exists in Russia and that seems to do business on sending mercenaries to participate in all sorts of military operations. And Lukashenko did it openly. He accused the Russians of trying to interfere into the Belarusian election. And of course, this must have left some scars on this relationship. So in this respect, I also think that, Putin will be watching. Of course, he still faces quite a few problems here. It's not to say that being a kingmaker, he has no difficult dilemmas. For instance, it is very obvious that Russia wanted to have a situation after the Belarusian election when Lukashenko would still stay in power, but would be weakened. But I think he is now so weakened that it is even problematic to think about concluding some big agreements with him for the time being. Because obviously, if, for instance, they force this bilateral deepened integration on Lukashenko, which they failed to achieve in previous years, where Lukashenko would say that, I'm not going to sign anything unless this is in the national interest of Belarus. Now, even if they force it on him because of how weak he is, it will certainly trigger a reaction from the population and from the protests. It might even become an additional trigger for the protests to grow. So in order to avoid this, I think Moscow, as I said, will continue assessing the situation, will still hold negotiations so that to advance in bilateral integration, but probably would not demand any quick agreements to be signed.
You just hinted at it. Russia has a track record of intervening in countries in its near abroad, which have seen popular uprisings, overturning governments. So if we take this one step further, do you think Putin would be willing to also invade and occupy Belarus, just as he did in Georgia and Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I think that would be a pretty bad scenario for Putin. And I think exactly for that reason, they are now backing Lukashenko, to make sure that he stays in power, and he is the factor why Belarus would stop even playing with the idea of improving relation with the West. Because, we need to give credit to Lukashenko and to any politician in Belarus. I think this is the most natural thing, the most natural policy line for a Belarusian statesman to adhere to. He's never been talking about any possibility of Belarus joining the EU or NATO or anything like that. On the contrary, he would always stress that Belarus was the most loyal and the most committed member of all those post-Soviet integration groupings, including the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a sort of post-Soviet NATO organization. Of course, very different, but just roughly with the same idea of mutual defense commitments. And that's why qualitatively, the situation in Belarus, the internal discussion, the agenda is very different. And while in Ukraine and Georgia, it was very obvious that Russia did not want to lose those territories to NATO, to the EU. Here they have very little to fear about. And that's why the easiest thing for them is to make sure Lukashenko is in power for now and they don't have to interfere physically.
What role does the EU and the US play? I mean, if the situation worsens further, do you think that they would stand up against Russia to protect the sovereignty of Belarus?
Well, we can be sure that this is not going to happen. Fortunately, unfortunately, that's a different normative discussion. But look at Ukraine. Ukraine, did everything which was even conceivable for a country which is not an EU member state, and of course, it still had no chance to receive any real support from the EU and United States. I mean, not in terms of some money, but in terms of something more serious when it came to defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity. So there is no way that the EU or the US can help Belarus in this respect. And I think it's also important that everyone understands this here on the ground so that no mistakes are made. And actually, one important thing to pay attention to is that the protest has no signs of any sort of geopolitical rivalry, geopolitical preferences. There is not a single EU flag which is seen in the protest. And this is also indicative of this mass understanding that the whole thing is not about a geopolitical thing, because a geopolitical thing would be really dangerous for the country.
We have already run out of time, but I would like to ask you two closing questions. What does the crisis mean for you personally and for the work of the Minsk Dialogue Council?
Well, it's at least a huge disruption for us. As you might know, what we've been focusing on in our work with the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations was trying to build on this initial image and initial capital of Belarus as a neutral territory, a neutral hub in Eastern Europe, so that to develop ideas to make the region a little bit safer. Because after the war in Donbass, after what happened to Crimea, Eastern Europe once again became the hotspot of Europe. And it was really important for us that Belarus remains in good relations with both Russia, but also improves its relations with the West, so that we can use this to bring in all sorts of people to our events. And David, you yourself participated at a large forum that we organized last year. I think the big added value of that forum, even though, there are all sorts of fora and conferences taking place all over the continent, but unlike most of them, ours was really, trying to be the place where people talk to one another, where the Russians talk to the Westerners, rather than where they gather like-minded people who talk about the others, but not to them, right? And of course, now that we are having this political crisis in Belarus, at least for the time being, these kinds of discussions are hard to organize. I still hope that we'll be able to continue our work in this or similar direction, but at least for now, we need to sort of rethink some of our approaches. And unfortunately, for the first time, we also need to think how to make sure that Belarus itself does not become one of the geopolitical crises on the continent. For now, it's still a domestic crisis, but there are unfortunately quite some reasons to think it might become a geopolitical crisis as well.
I would like to end on a positive note. What gives you hope that in 5 years from now, Belarus will be in a better place than today?
Well, the only thing which gives me this hope is that if we are not in a better place than today, then unfortunately, Belarus will lose a huge chunk of its, a huge part of its sovereignty. And since the absolute majority of the Belarusians seem to value the sovereignty, I think the only way to do so is to somehow find a way out of this crisis and some way find a better strategy which will satisfy broader population, which will not divide the population, which unfortunately has been the case recently, and which will also make Belarus an asset for regional security.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Yauheni, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Yauheni.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the beautiful and wonderful STARS family.
I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated in this webinar. In the next STARS webinar on the 2nd of October, we talk with Professor Dr. Huang Qing, one of the foremost experts on US-China relations, about what exactly the US and China are competing over, what it means for each side to win, and whether this competition is at all possible without ending in catastrophe. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.